There is a number that most Americans have never calculated, and it is probably the most consequential number in their financial lives. It is not their income. It is not their credit score. It is not their mortgage payment or their 401k balance. It is the annual cost of maintaining everything they own, not the purchase price, not the original sticker shock, the ongoing, compounding, never quite ending annual cost of keeping their possessions in their life, the storage, the maintenance, the insurance, the attention, the eventual disposal, the quiet financial drain that runs in the background whether or not they ever notice it. Most people have never calculated this number. And here is what is interesting. The people who have calculated it almost universally own less, not because they cannot afford things, but because they looked at the math and decided that most things were not worth it. Today, this is a video about that math. The average American household contains somewhere between 300,000 and 350,000 individual items. That figure comes from professional organizing research, and it should probably disturb you more than it does. 300,000 items, most of which, if they disappeared tomorrow, the household would not replace. Meanwhile, the personal savings rate in the United States, as of 2024, sits somewhere between 3 and 5% of disposable income, a figure that has declined roughly two-thirds from where it was in the early 1970s. The decline did not happen because Americans stopped earning money. Real household incomes have risen substantially over those 5 decades. It happened because as income rose, the ownership footprint rose with it, and the cost of maintaining that ownership footprint consumed the gains before they ever reached savings. This is not a story about income. It is a story about what happens to income once it arrives, and why two people earning similar salaries can end up in radically different financial positions by making different decisions about what they allow into their lives. Problem 1. The ownership tax. Every object you bring into your life levies an ownership tax. This is not a metaphor. It is a literal, recurring financial charge that continues for as long as you possess the item, invisible on any receipt, unacknowledged by any seller, and almost universally ignored by the buyer. The ownership tax has 4 components, and most people are familiar with only one of them. The first component is storage. Every item you own requires space to exist, and space in the United States costs money. Whether you own your home or rent it, every square foot dedicated to storing possessions is a square foot you are paying for. A garage converted into long-term storage for items you use seasonally, or never, is not free. It is a permanent monthly expense dressed up to look like a one-time acquisition. The self-storage industry in the United States generated approximately $40 billion in annual revenue as recently as 2023, making it larger than the Hollywood film industry. Americans are spending $40 billion a year to store things they do not have room for at home. This figure does not include the opportunity cost of the home square footage dedicated to the same purpose. The second component of the ownership tax is maintenance. Everything degrades. Everything requires periodic attention, cleaning, repair, or replacement of consumable parts. Consumer goods are deliberately engineered with maintenance cycles. Industry guidelines for home upkeep suggest budgeting between 1 and 2% of your home's value annually for maintenance. A $300,000 home generates $3,000 to $6,000 per year in expected maintenance costs simply by existing and aging. The third component is insurance. Most Americans understand they need homeowners or renters insurance. Fewer calculate what that insurance actually covers at the item level. The more you own, the more insurance you need. The more insurance you need, the higher your premiums. Every additional category of valuable possession you acquire is another variable that actuaries use to price your risk upward. The fourth component is the most expensive and the hardest to measure. It is cognitive load, the ongoing mental cost of owning things. Every item you own occupies some fraction of your available attention. It has to be tracked, organized, insured against loss, periodically cleaned, and eventually disposed of. Researchers studying household decision-making and cognitive depletion have found consistent evidence that the sheer quantity of decisions a physical environment demands correlates meaningfully with decision fatigue and stress levels. The more you own, the more you manage. The more you manage, the less cognitive resources you have available for anything else. This cost does not appear on any bill. It does not show up in your bank statement, but it is real, and it accumulates. When you add up all 4 components, storage, maintenance, insurance, cognitive load, The annual ownership tax on a typical American household is not a rounding error. Financial analysts who have attempted to quantify the total cost of ownership across all household categories have consistently found that the annual cost of maintaining possessions runs somewhere between 15 and 30% of the original purchase price per year across the lifetime of ownership. A $1,000 appliance that lasts 10 years does not cost $1,000. It costs conservatively $2,500 to $4,000 once the ownership tax is factored in. The minimalist insight, the thing that people who own less understand that most people do not, is that the purchase price is the least expensive part of owning anything. Problem 2, the upgrade engine. Somewhere in the mid-20th century, American consumer culture solved a problem that at the time seemed unsolvable. The problem was this: once everyone has a refrigerator, who buys another refrigerator? The answer, which the advertising industry arrived at with considerable ingenuity, was to make people feel that the refrigerator they had was not the right refrigerator, not broken, just wrong. The new one had different features, a different color, a different configuration. It implied a different kind of person. This was the invention of what economists call planned obsolescence, the deliberate engineering of dissatisfaction into the ownership experience. And it has been so thoroughly refined over the past 70 years that most Americans experience it as a completely natural feature of the world rather than a manufactured commercial strategy. The American smartphone market generates somewhere in the neighborhood of $150 to $200 billion annually. A substantial portion of that revenue does not come from people whose phones stopped working. It comes from people whose phones worked perfectly but felt old. The 2-year upgrade cycle is not a product of engineering necessity. Modern smartphones are durable enough to function well for 6 to 8 years. The 2-year cycle is a cultural artifact, manufactured and reinforced by carrier financing structures, social signaling norms, and marketing. The math here is uncomfortable. A household that upgrades 2 smartphones every 2 years, spending an average of $800 per phone, spends $1,600 per cycle, or approximately $800 per year, on functioning smartphones. A household that uses smartphones until they genuinely fail, roughly 6 to 8 years based on actual failure rates, spends roughly $200 to $250 per year on the same category. But smartphones are a single category. The upgrade engine runs across automobiles, furniture, clothing, kitchen appliances, home electronics, and recreational equipment. The average American car is replaced every 7 years, including cars that are mechanically sound at the time of replacement. The average American wardrobe turns over roughly 25 to 30% annually. The apparel industry has spent considerable effort shortening the felt psychological lifespan of clothing from years to seasons. What the upgrade engine has accomplished is something genuinely remarkable. It has made people feel financially irrational for holding on to things that work. The car that runs reliably has become somehow embarrassing. The kitchen from 12 years ago that functions perfectly has become a liability. The phone that makes calls, sends messages, and runs applications has become a signal of backwardness. Consumer culture has successfully reframed the act of keeping what works as a social deficiency rather than a financial virtue. The people who resist this framing, who define functional clearly, and who replace things only when they genuinely fail rather than when the market suggests they should feel bored, accumulate wealth at a rate that frequently astonishes them when they finally calculate it. Functional is a simple standard. It means the item serves its intended purpose adequately. Boredom is not a malfunction. The existence of a newer version is not a malfunction. The neighbor's upgrade is not a malfunction. Actual mechanical breakdown or genuine inability to perform required tasks is a malfunction. Everything before actual breakdown is the upgrade engine doing its job, which is to separate you from money you did not need to spend. Problem 3. The architecture of consumption. The problem with spending is that it has been made very easy. The problem with saving and investing is that it has been made, by comparison, somewhat annoying. This asymmetry is not accidental. It is the product of deliberate design choices made by industries that generate revenue when you spend and lose nothing when you do not save. Understanding this asymmetry, and then deliberately reversing it, is one of the most powerful financial moves available to any American household. Consider the modern spending environment. One-click purchasing, same-day delivery, stored payment credentials across dozens of platforms. Curated recommendation algorithms designed to surface items you are statistically likely to want, promotional pricing that creates artificial urgency, subscription models that shift spending below the conscious threshold. These are not neutral features. They are friction reduction technologies deployed in the service of commerce. The behavioral economics research on friction is unambiguous. Adding friction to a decision dramatically reduces the frequency with which people make that decision. A study of retirement enrollment found that switching from an opt-in to an automatic enrollment framework, removing friction from the saving decision, increased participation rates by 40 to 50 percentage points. The underlying preference for saving versus spending did not change. The friction did. When spending is frictionless and saving requires deliberate action, spending wins by default. Not because people prefer to spend, but because preference rarely drives behavior. Environment does. Humans, like most animals, follow the path of least resistance. Consumer culture has spent decades engineering the path of least resistance to point directly toward spending. Reversing this architecture is not complicated. It is merely counterintuitive because it means deliberately making your own life more difficult in ways that feel arbitrary. Spending friction looks like removing stored payment credentials from online retail platforms. It looks like unsubscribing from promotional email lists. It looks like establishing a rule that any non-essential purchase above a defined threshold requires 48 hours between the decision to buy and the act of buying. These interventions feel trivial. Their aggregate effect on annual discretionary spending is not trivial. Saving ease looks like automatic transfers from checking to investment accounts triggered on the same day as every paycheck, before any discretionary spending is possible. It looks like keeping checking account balances deliberately thin so that spending from checking requires a conscious transfer decision. It looks like configuring 401k contributions to increase automatically by 1% per year until they reach a target rate. The technical term for this approach is behavioral architecture. The underlying insight is that the financial choices most people think they are making based on will and preference are actually being made largely by the structural environment around them. Change the structure, and the choices change, without requiring any sustained effort of will. This is, incidentally, why the financial decisions of minimalists look so different from those of the general population. Minimalists have typically restructured their environment to make accumulation difficult and saving automatic. They are not more disciplined. They have engineered a different default. Problem 4, the sufficiency threshold. There is a question that consumer culture does not want you to answer. The question is, how much is enough? Not how much would be nice, not how much would be impressive, not how much would make you feel secure against every conceivable uncertainty. Simply, how much is enough for a life that you would actually find satisfying? Consumer culture does not want you to answer this question because the answer, once arrived at, functions as a finish line. And consumer culture depends on the absence of finish lines. The entire system is predicated on desire that regenerates faster than it is satisfied, on the constant production of new objects to want before you have fully absorbed the last object you acquired. The psychological mechanism underlying this is well documented. It is called hedonic adaptation, the human tendency to return to a roughly stable level of emotional satisfaction regardless of changes in circumstance. Research going back to the 1970s and updated repeatedly since has found that the happiness boost from acquiring a desired object or achieving a desired outcome fades within 3 to 6 months for most people, after which baseline returns. The new apartment, the new car, the new device, each one produces genuine satisfaction initially and then becomes the new normal, after which the next desired object appears on the horizon. Consumer culture does not cause hedonic adaptation. Hedonic adaptation is a feature of human psychology that appears to be universal. What consumer culture has done is identify it as a business model. If people always return to baseline, there is always room to sell them the next thing that promises to raise that baseline. The promise never permanently delivers. The spending never permanently stops. The people who break out of this cycle tend to do so by defining sufficiency explicitly, by arriving at a concrete answer to the question of how much is enough, and then holding that line. The research on what people actually value when they evaluate their own lives is relatively consistent. It clusters around experiences, relationships, health, autonomy, and purpose. Material possessions appear in these evaluations primarily when their absence creates genuine hardship. Above a threshold of adequacy, reliable shelter, transportation, nutrition, communication tools, and modest amenities, additional possessions do not systematically increase life satisfaction, and in many cases appear to reduce it by increasing the ownership tax and the cognitive management burden. The financial consequence of defining sufficiency is significant. A household that has defined its sufficiency threshold, that knows explicitly what it needs, maintains what works, and directs the remainder toward investments, is compounding. A household that has not defined sufficiency is leaking the same dollars into an ownership footprint that grows with income and never quite generates the satisfaction that was supposed to come with it. The math of that difference, projected over 20 or 30 years, is not a rounding error. It is often the difference between retiring early and working until 70. It is often the difference between financial optionality and financial anxiety. Understanding money is your best defense. The financial advice industry tends to focus on the supply side of personal finance: how to earn more, how to invest more optimally, how to select the right accounts and instruments. This is not wrong advice, but it is systematically incomplete because it ignores the demand side entirely. The minimalist money insight is not that less is always better. It is that less is often sufficient, and that the gap between sufficient and actual is where wealth is built or destroyed, year by year, across every household in America. The people who have done this calculation and acted on it are not living deprived lives. They are typically living smaller, quieter, more financially solvent lives. Their bank accounts are not thin. Their retirement accounts are not empty. Their stress levels in study after study are measurably lower. They own enough. And they have realized, which is the crucial thing, that enough is a choice. More on Money USA.